Patrick T. Smith, Assistant Professor of Theology and Philosophy at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary. Pat, it's good to have you with us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, guys, for having me. Sounds like you guys have a lot of fun on this show.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, it's debatable how much we get accomplished, Pat, but we do have a lot of fun.
Well, what's the real purpose of life?
That's right. So, what titles are we thinking here?
Well, and you're not going to introduce. That's his bio.
Oh,
He's my friend. I like him.
Go to the website.
Does he have any qualifications?
Is that if he's your friend, that's good enough? Good enough
That's right.
introduction?
Well, Pat's
any friend of yours is a friend of ours.
If you're connected to me, then you're legit.
Good to know.
Next thing you know, we're having some guy from the Jets on.
Well, it is fair. Why do we have Pat on? Well, Pat has a number of different expertise, but a lot of the things that he does much thinking about is areas of faith and reason in general, but areas related to bioethics and end-of-life care. And Pat serves in a number of different organizations related to end-of-life care. You're currently on basically a hospice team, if I'm not mistaken, right? The ethicist on staff for a hospice?
Yeah, that's actually located in Michigan. I serve as the ethics coordinator at Angela Hospice Care Center, and also in a Children's Hospital Boston's ethics committee, as well as the ethics committee for the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization.
Yeah, so obviously a lot of background in that area, and that relates to what we want to talk about, which is, I guess, really this general issue of end-of-life care. I mean, we'll just use that topic as a springboard to start to begin to delve in here. I mean, as we think of that, I mean, what should we be thinking about, Pat, when we think of end-of-life care? What are some of the issues that are out there? Why is it necessary to have an ethicist on staff with a hospice?
Wow, it's a great question. I mean, the first reality is simply this, is that even though we don't like to talk about it in our culture much, the fact is that we're all going to die at some point. The reality is that oftentimes in our churches, we do a fairly decent job, I think, of teaching people how to live, but rarely do we really help people think through how to die. And here again, as we'll get into this during the session, I'm not talking about issues of euthanasia here, but just what does it mean to die well enough in the midst of a fallen world. But that's the theological perspective. But the reality is also is that given the trajectory of healthcare in many ways and the very high costs that are often incurred at the end of life, in many ways we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing and why are we doing it, and do we need to do these different kinds of things, especially when we start talking about the amount of resources that with respect to the type of benefit that one can expect from some of these procedures as well. So just a lot of complex issues that not only deal with personal issues of how we live theologically in our community, right? But I think also an issue of a social area of, well, what are we doing with certain kinds of resources at the end of life? So I just think these issues are very important for us to think about, and at least to have an ethics coordinator at a hospice center, because there are all kinds of issues that come up, right? When is it appropriate to, let's say, terminate life-sustaining treatment, right? Is that ethical or is that unethical? If it is ethical or, let's say, morally permissible, then at what point is it morally permissible? Is it part of a Christian ethic to keep things going, the physical body going, let's say, at all cost? Is it ever appropriate to intentionally hasten the death of another person by introducing a lethal agent into the, let's say, medical relationship? So all these kinds of things do emerge in hospice context as well as just end-of-life care in general.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, let me just ask a really general question. I mean, it does seem to me, I mean, it kind of stems from where you begin. I mean, that the people in general they're afraid of death. They don't handle death. And Christians as well. And in some ways, as Christians, we should have a really robust understanding of death. And when we, particularly in terms of, I mean, as Paul says, for us to live to Christ, to die is gain. For what the Scripture speaks about what's going to happen after death. And yet, when we're faced with the reality of death, whether it's our own death or the death of you must say the last days of a loved one, people, I mean, if I can put it this way, people almost panic, or at least they start doing things or making decisions that I think you would suggest are kind of problematic.
Yeah, I think so. You raised this issue, of Paul's statement there in Philippians 1:21-24, when he was, wrestling with us to stay, with the community of believers because it would be a benefit to them, or just the anticipation, the great hope that he has to see his Lord. And I think that kind of language that, as the Spirit of God inspired the Scriptures, as Paul was giving these words, highlights the various tensions that we have in the biblical narrative concerning this whole process of death. I mean, on the one hand, I think we see the one biblical tension between death being a friend and foe, right? Now, obviously, when we think about death coming into the world, Romans chapter 5, verse 12, that, through one man's sin, death comes into the world. 1 Corinthians 15:21, this whole notion of since death came in through one man, the need for the second Adam and the sting of sin is death at the end of 1 Corinthians 15. So clearly sin and death are connected to each other in a way that is inseparable, one that we have to take note, and so that, yes, death is a foe that needs to be overcome. And thanks be unto God, we have that believers can overcome death through the person of Jesus Christ, make no mistake about it. But also in relationship to the fallenness of humanity, since that sin has entered into the world, there is a sense in which death can be a friend in some ways, as it ushers us into the presence of God for those who've placed their faith and trust in Christ. I think about a passage like the Psalms and Psalm 116:15. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints, right? That's very important language that's being used there.
Yeah.
Also, Paul uses language in 2 Timothy 4:6, where he talks about the time of one's departure after having fought the good fight of faith, right? Paul's language, again, that you raised, Philippians 1:21, same kind of thing. So there's this tension of death being both friend and foe in the biblical text that we have to wrestle with as believers and think through the theology of the great hope that we have and what that means for these decisions.
Yeah, you did a good job bringing out some key passages. There's a book called Evangelical Ethics. It's a little bit older, by John Jefferson Davis, and he says three things that we can say about death from the Bible, and I like the way he sort of sums up what you just said, I think. Death is unnatural, and so there we see death being brought into the world through sin. In fact, like you mentioned, the Bible describes it as the last enemy. So unnatural, inevitable, it will happen. Ecclesiastes 3:2 is a good example of that. Time to be born, time to die. Unnatural, inevitable, and for the Christian, not final. And I think that's where you get the idea of tension, because it is sort of the means that we're ushered into glory, as it were, into the presence of Christ. For the Christian, it is not final. 1 Corinthians, death is swallowed up in victory. Thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Would you say that's somewhat of a summary of what you were saying, or would you have any differences? Unnatural, inevitable, and for the Christian, not final.
Yeah, no, I agree with my colleague John Jefferson Davis on this point, and I think he's spot on. And I just highlight as well when we talk about unnatural. So sometimes you'll hear people who do end of life care, they'll say something like, "Oh, well, death is just a natural part of the living process." Well, one, I think oftentimes that kind of a statement is made apart from let's say, a Christian theological framework in terms of thinking about it. But even if we are thinking from a Christian theological framework, the only way I would say that we can only talk about death being natural is with respect to a natural part of the condition of human beings after the fall, right? Which is, again, goes back to the unnatural standpoint that Dr. Davis brings out in that regard. So I would wholeheartedly agree with what Jack Davis says there. And the other part where I think the third issue, not final, is so important to highlight kind of the tension between death as friend and foe, because it keeps us from thinking that this human life or this earthly life is to use the Latin phrase, the summum bonum, or the highest good in some way, because we want to be very careful not to just keep our physical existence going at all costs, regardless of any other considerations, to think that this is what it means to value life in some way. And so I think where he says unnatural, inevitable, and not final can keep us away from what's called vitalism, which is just keeping our existence going regardless of any other circumstances or considerations.
So J.J. Davis is still dropping science over there at Gordon-Conwell, right?
He is indeed. He's a good man.
You guys,
and a good friend.
You guys chop it up over lunch or play basketball together or anything like that?
Well, we don't play basketball. We do have a faculty, staff, student softball game at the beginning of every academic year. And so Jack Davis is known as Cracker Jack Davis because he's the pitcher for one of the teams. And so he makes his athletic contribution on the softball field.
Nice.
Oh. Yeah, basketball will be a little unfair. I mean, I know our listeners can't see you, but do you mind telling everyone how tall you are?
Oh, wow. Well, I'm about 6 feet, 6 inches tall.
6'6".
But could be easily blocked, as I've proven many times when I've been playing him.
Wow.
Well, see, there's much that can be said on that, but I'll save that for a different time, Vocab. You have to have me back, and we can talk about the ethics of perception when it comes to basketball.
Wow, this is a show indeed. All right, when we come back, it's Christian ethics and end-of-life care. That's all right. Or the best title of all, euthanasia. And I don't mean Japanese teenagers.
Wait for it.
Vocab, you don't always have to keep your promises. Like to come up with names.
But Bob, do you get it? Youth in Asia, Japanese teenagers?
If we're going to get some letters about that one. So, Pat, if you don't mind, let me take over and ask a serious question. At the beginning segment, you gave a great summary of all the related issues. Maybe we could just start with some definitions. Active and passive euthanasia would be one. I'd be curious for a brief, a definition as long as you want, and then speak to me how you approach. Do you like those terms? Do you use those terms in your own ethics on this issue?
Yeah, the general term or generic term euthanasia basically derives from classical Greek and literally means kind of a good death. But it has become a term that is used in our contemporary social context to refer to, as some would say, mercy killing, right, in the context of medicine. So often, to be fair to people who maybe would be in favor of euthanasia, which I am against it, but to be fair to those in certain contexts, they will say, well, look, euthanasia should only be considered in a medical context as an avenue of mercy, let's say, or an expression of autonomy of the patient to be able to, hasten his or her death if they think that the suffering has actually become unbearable from a given illness or some type of medical or physical condition. Okay, and so this is kind of a generic way of thinking about it. Oftentimes, there are various categories of thinking about this term as well. There's what's called voluntary active euthanasia. What that means is that simply the person actually gives consent that they want a lethal agent, whether it be drugs or something along that line, introduced into that relationship to hasten their death. There's what's called non-voluntary, active euthanasia, where the person doesn't give consent. Perhaps the person cannot give consent any longer to have euthanasia performed on them in some way. And then there's what's called involuntary euthanasia, which basically means that someone has been euthanized against his or her will.
That'd be active euthanasia.
I'm sorry, say that one more time?
That you would put, that's involuntary active euthanasia.
Active euthanasia, meaning that there is an active event, right? So there's an event that is being intentionally done to introduce a lethal agent to the existing pathology of a patient, right?
So there's actually 6 different sort of terms you could use, putting active and passive with those 3 modifiers. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's passive, which some have, or let's say passive euthanasia, which is a term that some have actually used to say, well, this just means termination of life support, right? So that if we need to withdraw or withhold some type of life-sustaining treatment, some will say, well, that's just passive euthanasia because you're not doing anything to kill the person. You're just removing something and letting the person die.
Do you make any distinction between withdrawing and withholding?
I'm sorry?
Do you make a distinction between withdrawing treatment and withholding treatment?
Yeah, I would say that while there is a distinction, it's not a morally relevant distinction. Okay. And the reason why I say it that way, because obviously it's a distinction when you say to withhold some type of treatment as opposed to withdraw it, right? I mean, there are those are two different words to kind of describe two different activities, right? Withholding, meaning not starting it to begin with, and withdrawing once some type of life-sustaining treatment has been started, then to cease doing that at some point. But the question more importantly, I think, is going to be, is there a morally relevant distinction between those two? And I want to say that there is not a morally relevant distinction between the two. Psychologically relevant, yes, meaning that if anyone has ever participated or seen the withdrawal of some life-sustaining treatments, sometimes that can be very hard to watch in some ways, and it feels, or psychologically feels, a little different in some ways. But morally speaking, if it is time where that life-sustaining treatment is either providing a burden to the patient or is actually futile care that it's not really doing what it's supposed to do, then in that sense, withholding or withdrawing would be morally on par in those kinds of situations.
What about this? Now, this is a little more simplified than what you just said, and of course, I'm tipping my hand by saying this. I found it helpful, and I've seen it in a couple different books I've looked into on this, sort of saying we must make a distinction between killing and letting die. Do you find that helpful, or could everything you just said sort of fit into one of those two categories, killing versus letting die?
Yeah, it could, but I think we do have to be careful with the way we use those distinctions and in what context we actually use those distinctions. And the reason is something like this, right? It would be nice if every situation of, well, let me start this way. There have been a lot of ethicists who have wrestled with this issue, some who are in favor, let's say, of euthanasia, have tried to say, but look, there's no bare distinction. In other words, the bare difference between killing and letting die is not really morally relevant. They'll say something like this. Say you have a 6-year-old who has a lot of money, and there's a cousin who stands to inherit a lot of money if the 6-year-old dies. And so let's say Jones, on one hand, plans to kill his or plans the death of his 6-year-old cousin. So he waits one day when he's getting into the bathtub, and what he was going to do is to hold the 6-year-old cousin's head underwater to drown the cousin, okay? So you see this happen, and then all of a sudden where Jones sees his cousin get into the bathtub, the small child slips, hits his head, and his face is in the water, right? And so Jones sits by and watches this, and so he simply allows the child to die, ready to hold the head down if the child would try to get up, but he simply watches and lets the child die. In another case, you have somebody like Smith, right?
Hold on, we'll get to Smith, Patrick T. Smith, when we come back, because that's the end of that segment. We'll continue, and we'll also ask, what are some biblical principles that Christians should be thinking of when they discuss this? We've taken time to lay out the issues. We'll continue to do that, as well as get into some of the passages and foundational issues behind it.
What are the morally problematic things that are related to euthanasia?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's one of those things, I think, where while, yes, there is, especially with health care, especially the end of life, there is a distinction between killing, introducing a lethal agent into the medical relationship, as opposed to letting a disease run its course from some type of terminal illness or some type of physical condition. Sometimes if we say that, well, there's a distinction between killing and letting die, such that every case of letting die is morally permissible, that's where I want to raise some caution, because there may be a time where there are responsibilities for healthcare providers to actually provide some type of treatment, and if they would just say, well, hey, I just simply let the person die, but that person very well's life could have been preserved, then we want to say that physician or healthcare professional is morally responsible even though they let that person die.
Patrick, would a good example of that be a Down syndrome child born that needed some sort of routine surgery because of an obstruction or something, which is not uncommon, and yet that would be withheld? They would let them die. Would that be a good example of something that would be morally not permissible?
Yes, that's right. That's a classic example of a case of letting die that
Bob
actually is
always
morally impermissible.
Always bringing up the classic things.
So absolutely. So that's kind of while the killing, letting die distinction is very, very important, it needs to be used very carefully in some of these conversations, because the real issue is, what is the intent behind person's acting in whatever decision that he or she makes in these, with respect to these very difficult decisions at the end of life.
So what are some Christian values or principles that can begin to help us make these decisions? And you and I have talked about this issue many times, and obviously there's complexities here, but one of the things that's been helpful to me is you've always said, before you really even get to that point, you need to establish, you might say, certain values, certain principles. And so as a Christian, we'll say specifically as Christians, what are some of the values and principles you think it's good to have, you might say, in your back pocket, kind of just, okay, here's where I'm starting from before I start to get into, you might say, the complexity of decisions needing to be made when it comes to end-of-life care?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, and I think a lot of this is going to come from one's basic worldview in many ways, and those of us who are Christians who operate and think about these issues from a Christian worldview, let me just highlight 3 or 4 here. I think the first is going to be the reality of the resurrection, right? We live and we serve in light of the hope of glory, right? I mean, that's the great hope that we have, and so we know that whatever it is that we're wrestling with and thinking about these issues, that the preservation of this life is not the ultimate end for us. I mean, we don't want to make this physical life an idol, which in many ways, if we try to just hang on regardless of any considerations, we come dangerously close, I think, to making this life an idol. The second thing I want to say is another theological tension that is raised by the reality of suffering. Now, we know that evil and suffering is a result of the fall again, but there is a sense in which suffering can be redemptive, right, in some way for us. I mean, we recognize that language that Paul uses in Romans 5, right? We know that suffering produces perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not disappoint us because God has poured out his love into our hearts by the Holy Spirit, whom he has given us, right? These different kinds of things are Paul's statement in 2 Corinthians 12:9. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness, right? So we do see suffering having a bit of redemptive value that leads us to our transformation in Christ's likeness, this side of the new heavens and new earth. But we also recognize that there's another side of suffering where we are called as believers to try to alleviate suffering at the same time. We see Jesus coming on the scene with his miracles, and obviously his miracles pointed beyond themselves to a greater reality of his identity, but we do see clear expressions of mercy and love to people undergoing the trials of physical pain and illness in the very ministry of Jesus. Many of the hospital and hospice movements were really perpetuated by Christians who took seriously this kind of ethic of love and care and loving the neighbor to deal with suffering.
Yeah, Pat, just hold on. We'll hit that last one in the next segment.
Okay.
I mean, what you just said brings up a couple different questions that will be worth exploring. So thank you for listening, and we'll pick it back up in the next go-around here.
On the phone, we have Patrick T. Smith from Gordon-Conwell, and I believe he's calling from the great state of M.A. Sometimes it's hard to pronounce Massachusetts, so I just say M.A. You are calling from Massachusetts, aren't you?
I am, and I'm not going to repeat the state because I run into the same problem, Vocab.
Really? Wow, that's good to hear, even from a guy living there.
You could just call it Taxachusetts.
That's right.
Oh, yeah.
Well, there it is.
Hey,
that is true.
Can you imitate the accent yet?
I'm sorry?
Can you imitate the Bostonian accent yet?
No, I tried a few times, and it didn't go over very well, so I resigned to the fact that I'm not going to try it again.
Well, we know you come from the illustrious land, Detroit. Can you imitate how they speak down there? Never mind, we'd have to edit you.
Hey, I'm a Southern guy at heart, so I stick with my native accent, and it served me well so far, and I hope it will continue to do so.
And you're speaking of Alabama, are you not?
I am indeed.
Did you play basketball, Charles Barkley, at Auburn? I can't say that.
No, I didn't. I didn't. Not at all. We're not really known for our solid basketball teams, but we do know a little bit about football, even though our past year was not the greatest.
That's funny.
Interesting. Well, look, I have found this discussion enlightening, but I don't ever want to assume too much. And also just in my, simple mind, it helps to break it down. We're talking about thinking biblically about end-of-life care, end-of-life issues. And we've said, I think, helpful things to get us thinking on this track. And we're going to talk some about hospice care here in a second. But to bring it back, I mean, the foundational issue when we say, what is the biblical teaching on this? I mean, I would just like to draw people's attention to Exodus 20:13. You shall not murder. Now, that's the starting place. Now we're saying, what are the implications of that in real life? And of course, God tells us why murder is wrong, at least in part. When you go to Genesis and you see, look, I've made them in my image, so you can't do this. Man is to express the glory of God. We see God creating everything in Genesis 1. And so that's sort of where we start. Of course, Genesis, the Exodus 20:13 passage, thou shalt not murder, is reaffirmed in Matthew 18:19, Romans 13:9. So I think we're starting there. And, Wayne Grudem, he has a chapter in his book, Politics According to the Bible. He has a section, should I say, on euthanasia. And he says, it does not say you shall not murder except when a person is more than 80 or 90 years old, or you shall not murder except when a very ill person wants to be murdered. And I know some people that may say, wait, let's stick with the high philosophy, but I do think that is where we're starting from. Before we move on to the hospice stuff, do you have other things you want to add or tack on to that about sort of the foundational issue from which we're working from?
Yeah, and that was going to my last point after talking about the importance of the resurrection and then the reality of suffering in a fallen world, and then going back to the very sanctity of life as being described in the biblical ethic, which really appealed to many of those passages that you've just highlighted. Vocab is going to be very, very important. I think the real issue that where a lot of debate and conversation still needs to be had is what actually constitutes murder in some way or other, right? There are many people who are, regardless of what we think about, something like is that may be controversial, like capital punishment. Regardless of what we think, people on both sides of that debate, some think, well, look, that's just murder as well. Others say, no, that's justified killing. So while that certainly is the biblical ethic, we affirm that as part of the sanctity of human life. The real, I think, conversation needs to be had as to what are the kinds of things that constitute, murder, especially when you're dealing with things at the end of life. So if somebody wants to give, let's say, some very strong sedatives at the very end of life to manage pain, and let's say there's respiratory depression, is that an instance of murder or managing pain? So those are the kinds of difficult things to think through. But those three areas, I would say, would be very important for guidelines for Christians: the reality of the resurrection, the tension, biblical tension that we see of suffering, and the true value of, or the sanctity of human life that's described in the biblical ethic.
So, really, I mean, I think you brought up something I think that's helpful. It's helpful to realize that there is a means by which we can, you might say, alleviate pain and suffering, and that's not wrong to do that. And that's really where much of the angst comes for people when they face these issues and make decisions that are morally wrong, that involve essentially actively killing, bringing in a lethal agent. That the issue is seeing someone in pain, and that's where you speak of palliative care and other things that we can do and provide, and we encourage, and you should do so. That when people are in that kind of dying process, there's much we can do to manage pain, and that's and as Christians, we want to be able to do that. We want to step away from doing anything that says, no, we need to, because of what's going on here, we want to end this person's life because of what we understand the biblical text to say.
But it gets very difficult in practice, having gone through this myself 4 or 5 times in the last couple of years. For example, morphine is often used for that painkiller, and the trade-off between alleviating pain and actually hastening death is not clear. At least it's not clear to me as a layman. And that's where I have struggled personally with the end-of-life issues, is where do you draw that line? And I think, Patrick, you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Do you have any insight on that very common issue that comes up almost a lot these days in hospice care?
Yeah, you're right, Bob. I mean, this is one of those things that really is a struggle for many, many people. And it's a struggle even for myself for a time. And I started talking with some of my professional colleagues who are clinicians in this. And again, to get, I don't want to get into all the technical details, here, but the reality is that there's a lot of fear, sometimes unwarranted fear, concerning certain palliative medicines. I mentioned earlier in our time together that, what I think makes, medical euthanasia wrong is that it introduces a lethal substance into the, let's say, the medical professional care relationship. Drugs like morphine really is not a lethal drug. It's very telling that states who look at physician-aided or physician-assisted dying in some way, they don't really use morphine as one of the agents by which to do that work, because in reality it's a pretty poor toxin in many ways. If we think about something like Tylenol, right? Tylenol, if we take a certain amount of Tylenol per day, it's going to shut down our liver, right? But so any drug that's taken in excess is always going to be problematic. Something like morphine, what happens is people say, well, is not a side effect of morphine respiratory depression, such that if you give a lot of morphine at the end of life, that necessarily decreases respiration and the person dies. Well, that's not exactly how the drug works. A lot of times, people have built up a huge resistance to morphine depending on how long they've been on it. So it's not uncommon in pain management to give increasing doses even as the person is dying, and that in and of itself is not necessarily hastening the death. It's because there's a tolerance that's being built up such that there's more that is needed to achieve the same effect. The second thing I want to just say about this issue is with respect to morphine, a lot of times the person's body is being taxed or physically stressed in some way, such that respiratory depression doesn't stop the person from breathing, but actually relaxes the body so that the person can be more comfortable, and in some cases actually prolongs life. So all of this to say that can there be doses of morphine that can be given that will certainly take a patient out? Absolutely, but that doesn't have anything to do with morphine in itself or other palliative medicines. It just has everything to do with misusing those drugs as well as any kind of drug, just like Tylenol as well.
We can go back to the kind of context of the church as Christian leaders, or just people in the church in general. I mean, what should we be doing to better prepare ourselves to make really biblically faithful decisions when it comes to end of life and it comes to death? I mean, what are some of the things that you would like to see happen more within churches so that people, you can easily see, there's so many different complexities in this, and yet there's some really clear values, and I appreciate what you said, how we view the resurrection, suffering, sanctity of life, thou shalt not murder, those type of things. What are things that you would like to see happen in churches to help people be faithful when it comes to decisions like this?
Yeah, one of the things I try to do in the context of our classes here is really encourage students to be faithful in teaching about these issues, not to shy away from the reality of death, and that, look, we're all going to have to wrestle with this. As leaders, we're going to be in these contexts where we have to walk with people at the end of life. And so certainly to preach and to teach the reality of our theological doctrines and what that means for us in terms of facing death, or as Paul Ramsey would say, dying well enough, right? Because we know it's a result of sin in many ways. But I think the other point is to recognize the ambiguity around some of these issues. I think too often we want very nice black and white, clear-cut, kind of instruction as to, okay, when this happens, then do this, or when this happens, do that. The reality is there's much more ambiguity here than perhaps we realize. And this is not to say that there are not wrong things and right things to do, but what I mean by ambiguity, in terms of, there may come a point in which we should say, look, you know what, it's futile now to continue to this particular life-sustaining treatment, right? Now, the Bible doesn't tell us, it doesn't give us chapter and verse as to, when we should do these different kinds of things. It just gives these broad principles, and we have to exercise good judgment and wisdom. And so I think learning about how these different palliative medicines work, at the end of life, what happens to the body as the body is actively transitioning in the dying process, and people who work in hospice and pain management can help the church with this. And so I would just want to encourage the church not only to think about it from a biblical perspective, but also employ those in your congregations who are healthcare professionals who have some insight on this, and really commission them to share some of this data and their experiences with the congregation so that we can do ethics in community, which I think is very, very important for the church.
Let me share you a quote. This is slightly different than where we're going. We only have a few minutes left, but part of what we did is try to lay down some foundational principles. And I think your 3 points, could you just say those 3 points again one more time? The reality of the resurrection, what the 3 main points you said, the principles that we begin to reason from about this?
Theological tension of suffering and the sanctity of life. Those are 3?
Yes. Those are really good take-homes. That's why I wanted you to reiterate those. But just to get a flavor,
I thought you were talking about the previous
of someone else's perspective, if you could quickly comment on this, because I want to introduce this, and we only have a few minutes left. But listen to this. This is from Dr. Philip Nitschke. He's the so-called other Dr. Death. This is from National Review Online, and look at what he says here. Quote, if you believe that your body belongs to God and that to cut short a life is a crime against God, then you will clearly not agree with my thoughts on this issue. I do not mind people holding these beliefs and suffering as much as they wish as they die. For them, redemptive suffering may well pry open heaven's door that little bit wider. And if that is their belief, they are welcome to it, but I strongly object to having those views shoved down my neck. I want my belief that human life is not sacred accorded the same respect. A 30-second comment on the other side's perspective, Pat Smith.
Wow. Look, I mean, this is many people often push back about what the sacred sanctity of life means. Many people say that in order to hold a theological view on these issues of the sanctity of life, that means that you just have to endure suffering at all costs, no matter what. One of the things that I've just tried to actually say is that to have a view of the sanctity of life does not entail medical vitalism, as the quote that you just read suggests, that in order to hold the sanctity of life, you have to hold medical vitalism. That's what I want to actually reject and say that we actually have theological reasons for rejecting medical vitalism when we look at the Christian story as a whole, not only this side of the new heavens and the new earth, but the hope of the new heavens and the new earth.
I think that was helpful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Pat Smith.